I'd now like to call on Art DeFehr for his thoughts.
I noticed that Reg chose to position me between four professors over here, and so I'm not quite sure what he's expecting to be different, but we'll find out.
Welcome to the club. Yeah.
As he mentioned, I graduated at least from Winnipeg in the early 60s, mid 60s, and then went to a couple of more universities in the States. And so I spent my time in the U.S. during that very interesting period. My kids who graduated a generation later are very jealous because they grew up at a time when nothing was happening in their view. And I was involved in, as I said, anything that moved, I was marching with it. And I'm still a Nexus poster child, and that I never get, my card never seems to arrive. But it's true. Even Janet Napolitano has dealt with it. Can't figure it out. But let me start with a story. I appreciated Alan Freeman's talking about this being an ethical question and wasn't part of what I was going to say, but I think it's very important because I actually do view the current question that we have, or the current issue, as having a very strong moral dimension to it. And it's not a religious question. I just think, let me explain in a moment. In 1989, my family's Russian Mennonite, so comes from back there. In 1989, I met the #2 diplomat from the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. And we became friends at some events, and I told him my story. And he says, Art, you have to go back to the Soviet Union. And I said, why? I did nothing for my family. A lot of them were killed there. I don't owe them anything. He says, forget that stuff. The people there didn't cause the problem. It's the system. Don't blame the current people. But he said, you go back because you have something to offer. I said, tell me. He says, well, he says, this was 1989, 2.5 years before the coup that ended communism. He said, we will, and he was head of the Institute of Canadian American Studies, so he knew the North American system well. He said, we will, sometime in the not distant future, attempt a market system, and we will fail. And he said, why will we fail? He says, 2 reasons. He says, one is after 70 years, we have no idea how to be entrepreneurs anymore, and people like yourself have to come back and begin to teach us that. We don't need the GMs and IBMs of the world. They're like our oligarchs. They'll be the same, or our big companies. But he said the second thing was very interesting. He said he knew my Christian background. He says, after 70 years and what communism has done, said in the West, when you people do a deal, he said, this is 1989, that's why I say it's very important. He says, when you meet and do a transaction, you shake hands with somebody, you have a high expectation that the other person will follow through, go back the next day and sign the papers or pay the bill and follow through. And the comment he made, he says, many of you may not go to the church or the synagogue anymore, but your parents did, and there's enough memory that you in fact behave that way. So in the Soviet Union, that memory is gone. And when the moment you've got the money, the deal is done. And I've experienced that. I went and worked there. I actually went back to the Soviet Union in that same year and organized 4 national conferences on business and ethics. And 3 of them in communist times, in Communist Party buildings with Lenin or Marx looking over my shoulder on a big painting. And obviously I wasn't very successful. But it was a very, very interesting time. And when you look fast forward now to what's happening today, and we look fast forward to Russia, where finally after 20 years, the people are saying enough, even with Putin. They're saying, you know, it didn't work. Even the political system didn't work, and the market system certainly hasn't worked there as well. So I think it's very important that now you look at our own situation, and if you look at the kind of words that people are using about our financial crisis or the crisis of the last couple of years. They don't use things like, you know, that a regulation failed. They're talking about bankers' greed. Well, greed is a moral term. That's not a rules, a regulatory term. When we talk about but you look at what's happening in terms of the taxation debates in the U.S., and you're talking about a lot of the things that have dealt with the inability to confront the inequality question as a fundamental question of society is really a moral question, many of these things. So my view is, I know Mark Carney reasonably well. I sent him a note, good luck, I says, because what you're dealing with is, and what you're really saying is that he's supposed to deal with a regulatory framework to replace what used to be dealt with substantially with internal discipline and a certain moral understanding. So we're saying that in in the North Mediterranean countries and in other places in the world, there's an absence of any ethical understanding. Now we're supposed to have enough regulations to replace that. We used to have it in places like China because they have what's called discipline, because they punish you if you don't. And when that discipline disappears, watch out. In China, I've spent a lot of time there as well, and I'm very concerned about that side as well. That wasn't what I was going to say, but I think I appreciate that Alan's introduction. But I do think that there is fundamentally that we're dealing with issues which have an ethical underpinning to them, because the market system does require a certain level of trust. And if that level of trust and understanding disappears, you've got a problem. So the questions that I was going to speak to is, there's a couple of what I have to switch. I just got cataract surgery done. I got to switch from not wearing glasses to wearing glasses, so I'm getting used to it. But what are some of the big questions? And one of the questions, do we really believe that what I call as current economic and social issues call for a major realignment of our economy, politics, or social structures? If they do, then how is that going to happen? If they don't, then we have a different question, but something went wrong. On the Occupy question, is the Occupy movement a flavor of the month, or does it suggest that there's fire in the volcano and something's going to happen eventually? Clearly, it hasn't ignited the world this time. But is it making a statement, or is it something that we'll forget about next year? I look at one my own business. I said, does it matter if your own business is perceived as part of the problem or part of the solution? I spoke with a colleague the other day whose friend who's a billionaire decided to sell their yacht. They're afraid to be people who own a very large yacht. And they said, maybe we shouldn't have that. Something has changed. And then I think the big question may come to an end is the kind of thing that's happened the last couple of years, is it the kind of issue that can invite a movement which can create productive change? And we may come back to later. I think the issues are driving this outburst are fairly well known. So they were partially stated, but let me repeat them again because they weren't stated in a complete form. First, the growing inequality, which was mentioned, so I won't say anything more on that. But the question I will ask, is there a tipping point when it becomes unsustainable in our society? Now, there are societies that are very unequal, but a lot of that then depends. I do a lot of work in Mexico. It depends on the political structure. Some political structures can handle a lot more inequality. We still have a fair degree of noisy democracy, and in that kind of how much inequality can you sustain? The other one is the financial system. I think there's a widespread view, even among people who would be normally sympathetic to it, that it's out of control. I've been observing for a number of years that the financial system in North America has taken about 40% of the profits for most of the last decade. And if you look at their contribution towards society, what they actually produce, there's a real question, is that worth 40% of the income of society? And a lot of people would say no. The second part I already mentioned, there's an absence of internal discipline or self-control, which then comes out as the word greed. Third one we haven't talked about is the politics itself, and I think that if the political system was sound, you could maybe deal with these questions. But when the political system has been almost completely corrupted by money and maybe some other issues, structural issues, then how do you in fact correct other parts of the system? And I think many people are losing faith in this. They're not only losing faith in the economic system, but probably even more so in the political system. And I think countries are different, but certainly we all have watched TV in the process, and the US system has become not only dysfunctional, I call it structurally dysfunctional, and that's a bigger problem. An interesting one is global competition. We often, and I would say that global competition, while I think we all want the world to become more complex, it isn't a neutral factor, and that's because there's a couple of reasons. One is that it creates pressures which are sometimes artificial for a period of time, and they can be I don't know if they're destructive or whatever it is. Maybe the question that I will leave that if Reg wants to deal with is one of the things that if you get back to the Occupy movement, I wanted to spend a moment on that, is if you've got all these disruptive or these dysfunctional forces in the economy, in the financial system, the political system, are these the kind of issues that can create a counterbalancing movement. I think the Occupy movement speaks to, like they said, we have lots of things we're critical of, but can you have a movement that can actually change that if you don't have a proper focus? As I said, I grew up in the 60s, and probably what radicalized me more than anything was the civil rights movement. And I consider myself very fortunate to have been around at that time, because I think it gives a person a perspective that for life. I was actually part of the Selma Montgomery March, which is not that many people were. But it certainly radicalized me in a way that makes me sensitive to other kind of issues. But the question, I think the real issue is that the problems are so disparate when you talk about a political system and you talk about a financial regulation and you talk about economic factors. How do you put them into something which creates a movement which actually can say, what change do you need? In the civil rights movement, we had a very clear idea what the outcome was. And if you had certain kind of outcomes and laws and access to schools, then you had got what you had wanted in the problem, or at least moving in the right direction. In this thing, there are so many different issues that I don't think, if you don't have a singular outcome that is right, then it's very hard to get a movement going, because they can talk about the 1%. The point is, a lot of the people in the next 30, 40% feel okay about the system, are doing okay. It isn't only the 1% doing good. So I think that the Occupy movement is saying there's something wrong, but what I'm wondering is if with that kind of a range of issues, it's possible to get a movement together which actually speak to its solutions. And that worries me, because I think we actually have to solve some problems.
Thank you very much. Now, the handheld microphone is with Hari. And where is Scott? Scott is coming right back. I'm going to ask Scott if he would take the microphone, and let's first see if there's a question or two for Art, and then we'll move to the overall panel. I see a hand right there, Scott. Woman in the second row.
Thanks. I appreciated what you had to say about the differences between the civil rights movement and the Occupy movement. I think that's very true, that and maybe part of the reason why it's such a challenge now is that there's an awareness that simply seeking passage of a few laws isn't going to solve the problem. I'm wondering if you see the solution as being a restoration of this sense of moral self-control, absence of greed that you were speaking of, or whether the problem is bigger and a need to, in some sort of way, transform an economic system that actively rewards greed.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the idea that it will be based on, again, we're assuming that morality was there before. I mean, something was there before, at least, although there were other periods of inequality as well. But I think the capitalist system, the market system itself, did seem to have some better underpinnings than it has right now. And it was also different maybe at an earlier stage. I don't expect we're going to we're going to have an evangelistic revival of some kind which is going to result in morality. We're going to have to find our way in a different way. And so probably this is going to have to come. Well, what's happening in Europe right now? What's happening in Europe right now is Angela Merkel simply saying that for no particular moral reason said if a German works till 67, they're not going to subsidize a Greek pension at 55. Okay, so you have to kind of have an understanding of that that we all have to, in a sense, there are some behavior patterns which have to be defended and put in place which allow the system to work. And I think the idea that the system, a system that can work without regulation, which was the let's say the Republican mantra the last 20, 30 years, I think is in relatively disrepute. And it's got nothing to do whether it's Republican or Democrat. I think that we have to move off that agenda and simply saying that we need, we clearly need leadership at the top, which creates an understanding. And it's hard to, because you don't want to put the kind of say, well, those people who have lots of regulation, a lot of government is the answer. But clearly we need a consensus about what works, and somebody has to have the leadership to talk about that. Right now it's not out there.
Let's go to the second row, please. The microphone is coming right behind you. There we go.
There's just been talk about how when it comes to change in the way people are being paid, it's also a change in the way we value our employees and also the culture of the company and the organization as a whole. And to do that, there would have to be some changes in the way the CEOs and the leaders and executives view what their work is worth. So if we're going to change that the difference in the ratio as how the wages are being paid and the executives and how they're paid, would that be a deterrent as to how the work of the leaders, or if they would leave, how would companies retain expertise and leadership that they would want in a good organization? How would we control that when it comes to trying to figure out the balance?
Well, I think one of the important things is to realize that even within our Western or fully developed societies, clearly some societies have answered that question differently. I mean, so some of the economists may have better stats than I have, but I mean, the statistics in the European CEO relative to their average income is very different. My income, I happen to try to practice what I preach. My income is between 10 and 12 times my average production worker's income, and I simply figure it's enough. And, so it's my own choice. I own the company, so it's easier to do. But no, but I'm still saying it's a point of view. But I think clearly something happened in the last 20, 30 years in North America which has gotten on the wrong track. It hasn't happened as completely in Europe. Like I said, it's not one thing. It's many different things. It's the lack of regulation banking. It's the CEO pay. There's a whole bunch of things when added together eventually have caused a breakdown, reached the crisis point.
Another question right in the back. Is that Calvin?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. Talking about the difference between North America and Europe and some of the thoughts that are going through my head that I'd be curious to get your comment on. Some of the changes, especially in the last 40 years, you've got, for example, in the wealthy segment of society, especially in American society, a lot of social goods that people require, education, security, healthcare, you can obtain on a private basis, live in a gated community, and so you no longer have need for the public services, so you have less of a vested interest in the quality of those services, which affect a very broad segment of society. And then the other thought that enters my mind is land use planning in the last 40 years has had a lot of segregation of our uses. So mixes of income types and mixes of our uses on a daily basis are changing so that a wealthy person can live in a wealthy, affluent neighborhood, jump into their single-use automobile, drive directly to their place of employment, and never interact with those of lesser means. And I wonder if you'd have any commentary on how this might play into the moral question, if that starts eroding the moral connection that we have with each other in society.
Well, let me give one answer, and others may want to answer that. Those of you who live in Winnipeg, or I assume most of you do, some of you may have been to Pritchard Farm Properties. That was developed by myself, and that was developed because the city planners said that if you're rich, you should move to Tuxedo, and otherwise it's a blue-collar area in the Northeast. My father wanted to stay where their grandkids were, so we started building stuff there. But it's really the idea of Pritchard Farm Properties is I had people come to me at the time and want to take some bays on that and create little gated communities in there. Like we'll take 10, 20 lots and put a gate on. And I wouldn't sell it to anybody who wanted to put a gate in. In fact, if you walk along the creek, you'll notice that there's not a single fence along 4 kilometers of creeks. And the reason for that is because written in the regulations, you can put a metal dog fence in there that you can look through. But if you want to live on the creek, you're completely visible to the community, so that the idea if you walk along the creek, your neighbor can see you and talk to you and vice versa. If you don't want that, then don't buy a house on the creek. So the whole idea is become a very strong community. It was built with a community in mind. I just went to us today with the city planners. We're trying in the Northeast to develop a community of 3,000 people on one of the few vacant empty pieces over there. Again, completely integrated toward a center built around transit. Yes, I think the nature of community has a lot to do with it, and it begins with planning, and it also begins with will.